Hello, this is Derek Taylor for HIST 141, U.S. History since 1877. This is the final lecture of the semester, From the Rewrite to the New World Order, 1972 to 2016. Talk about the collapse of Richard Nixon and go up through the rise of conservatism in the 1980s, the end of the Cold War. And I'll talk a little bit about the intervening 25 years we'll get to. Just an overview of things I'll mention in this lecture. Talk about deindustrialization, its effect on the working class, conservatism as it arises in the 1970s and changes in family life, and the end of the Cold War is the biggest things. But I'll also have a section at the end about globalization and the emergence of a multipolar world, because when the Cold War ends, it looks like the world is an American world, that we can kind of do whatever we want. We can run the world. This is what gets us into Iraq and places like that. And how we get to the moment we're kind of in where it seems like all that's come to an end. I'll brush up on that toward the end and some other things as well. Anyway, let's get started. First of all, the politics of disillusionment in the 1970s. People are already cynical about government. By the early 1970s, they get more so after the fall of Richard Nixon. Remember, Richard Nixon had won a massive victory in the 1972 presidential campaign. Seemed like he was on top of the world. However, in June of 1972, 5 men with connections to his administration were arrested for breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate apartment complex in Washington, D.C. The White House had established an intelligence group known as Plumbers to plug government information leaks and to harass administration opponents, all financed by illegal fundraising by the Nixon campaign committee to reelect him. Nixon denied any involvement in the break-in, but investigations revealed that he had ordered his chief of staff to tell intelligence agencies not to probe too deeply into connections between the White House and the burglars. The Senate got involved in 1973, began holding hearings. People began to sort of fess up one after the other, eventually implicating Nixon in all this. One aide revealed that he had a taping system, a secret taping system in the Oval Office. All this eventually came out in the hearings on June 30th, 1974. The House of Representatives, I should mention it's a democratically controlled Congress, so they had partisan reasons to go after him, but he was finished anyway, voted on 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and subverting the Constitution. He would almost certainly have been convicted. By the way, all Republicans would have voted against him too as well. But facing this, he became the first and only president of the United States to resign from office on August 9th, 1974. His vice president, Gerald Ford, was sworn in. A month later, Gerald Ford pardoned him, gave him a full, free, and absolute pardon. And the Watergate scandal sort of punctuated a decline of trust Americans had in their government. If you know who the novelist Stephen King is, the horror novelist, he published his first novel, Salem's Lot, as a vampire novel in 1974. And he gave an interview one time where he talked about while he was writing the book, he was watching the Watergate hearings on TV. And I mention this because the plot of that novel is about a writer, very autobiographical of him, about a writer who goes back home to his old hometown in New England and discovers that it's been taken over by a vampire. And it's kind of he writes it as it's horror, right? It's not, he's not doing anything special with it, but it's not a bad allegory for the way people must have felt about their government by the early 1970s. It turns out that the people you thought you knew who were running your country are actually people who are feeding off of it. So it's kind of captures the era a little bit in terms of just the plot and everything. And there are attempts, I won't go through all this stuff, it's in your textbook, series of acts passed by Congress to try to restrict things like campaign fundraising, try to restrict the presidential war powers. That was part of the thing, is he was abusing his war powers, as well as a new Freedom of Information Act to try to guarantee greater access to federal government agencies to get files that agencies had amassed on citizens. All of which, of course, sounds funny in the light of the kind of things people in the government's been doing in the last 10 years or so, or at least since the Iraq War started. But none of it, unfortunately, worked out too well in the end. Same time, people became disillusioned with the economy because it took a dump. Okay, it was too graphic. It went downhill. Things kind of deteriorated for a lot of different reasons. One was a big energy crisis. United States had once been the world leading producer of oil, but had been surpassed and was now dependent on oil mostly from the Persian Gulf. The Middle Eastern states had thrown off their European colonial rulers. They demanded concessions for access to their oil fields. They formed a cartel, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, in the 1960s. And what happens is you get conflicts between these Arab states, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, between 1967 and 73, between these states and the state of Israel. In the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Egypt and Syria invaded Israel to regain territory, but Israel prevailed. And resentful of the support that the American government gave to Israel, the Arab states and OPEC declared an oil embargo on the United States in 1973. And all of a sudden, things kind of went downhill. The U.S. had to scramble to meet its energy needs. Congress imposed a national speed limit of 55 miles an hour to conserve fuel. Americans began to buy smaller, more fuel-efficient cars. This was the end of the heyday of American cars being these gigantic cars. I shouldn't say the end. They have them today. That's what SUVs are for. But they used to all be like that, and that kind of goes into that. Sales of American cars were hit badly by this. It definitely hit the auto industry at that point, which had ripple effects across the economy. And compounding all this was inflation, which was partly set off by the oil shortage of the 1970, excuse me, of that year. But in addition to all this, it had much longer term problems, particularly the government spending. Remember, the federal government had tried to fight a big war and expand its social programs in the Great Society. This means two things: a ballooning federal deficit and spiraling inflation. When you spend too much money you don't have, prices go up, kind of like they're going up now. And that took better part of a decade. It took until the 80s to try to get down and control it. This is what's sometimes called in the industrial sector. The United States finally was facing competition from abroad. West Germany, Japan, its share of world trade dropped to from 32% to 18% by 1870, kept going downward. And this is all part of the transition from an industrial economy to a service economy. And in the short run, it was hit by a combination of unemployment and inflation, for which economists use the word stagflation, stagnation and inflation. And so this meant for a lot of Americans a noticeable decline in their standard of living. None of the presidents in that decade had much luck doing anything about this. But the biggest thing that happened was the hit the industrial sector took. The steel industry suffered as foreign steel flooded in the United States during the 1970s. And you began to have whole areas of the country being stripped of its industrial base. You have blue-collar workers being put out of well-paid union jobs, factories being closed, being offshore. We'll get to this a little later on, but this is only beginning in the 1970s, I should say. It particularly deals a death blow in many ways to the labor movement. At this point, everyone's retrenching. The unions are basically trying to save what jobs they can. Union membership begins to decline and has been declining more or less ever since. At the same time, you also have middle-class flight from the suburbs, which hits the cities, because of pricing, inflation, and piles of debt in the cities, because you have social services for the poor being initiated in big cities in the 1970s. Nearly every major American city in the 1970s struggled to pay its bills. And so you have this suburbanization of the country where people are fleeing taxes in the cities and going to the suburbs. It's sometimes called tax revolts. So you have a lot of just hauling out of cities, hauling out of especially industrial cities in the 1970s. If you watch any films from the era, you get a real good sense of that, what the cities look like. And it's not just because they had uglier cities or whatever, it's because they're going through real economic pain in a way we probably haven't experienced maybe until the last 10 years or so. I don't know. And then finally, you also have, again, I mentioned some of those post-Watergate reforms already, but you have attempts by a Democratic Congress to try to restore people's confidence in government. Doesn't work. A bunch of new Democratic members came into the House after 1974 in the midterm elections. They, of course, they used Watergate against the Republicans. They eliminated the House Un-American Activities Committee. They reduced the number of votes needed to end a filibuster from 67 to 60. They also dismantled the existing committee structure in Congress. Reason for this is because committees were controlled by hands of a few elite committee chairs, and they wanted to open up influence other people. They passed an Ethics in Government Act. However, none of this actually worked and actually kind of backfired. It was supposed to make government more efficient, more transparent, but it made it less efficient and more susceptible to lobbying. The more diffuse power structure actually gave lobbyists more people to sort of exert influence upon. And influence went from these committee chairs to party leaders, which gave them very little incentive to compromise. So you're beginning to have more and more. This is a phrase nobody uses anymore, but back when I was a kid, the term was gridlock, because they would just, stalemate and everything. And despite all this, Democratic Congresses couldn't do much again to stop the economic woes of the decade. Then in 1976, in the election, Jimmy Carter defeated Gerald Ford with 50% of the popular vote. But he was an inexperienced former governor of Georgia, and he came to Washington contemptuous of people there. He thought he was a reformer, he was an outsider, and he relied on inexperienced advisors from his time in Georgia, and this led to bad relationships with people in Congress. And most of his efforts to try to reignite economic growth did not pan out. Then in 1979, there's a revolution in Iran, which further curtailed oil supplies, made gas prices go up, and Carter had a tough time of it, long story short. Here you can see the inflation rate, how it spikes in the 70s and then actually gets worse in the first couple of years. We'll get to Reagan in a second, before being brought down, going back down and not coming up again to the late 1980s. Inflation is why gas jumped so much so recently. If you're wondering what inflation does, when the price of food. This is a graph of unemployment in the 1970s, and you can kind of see how it rises in the 1970s, comes down a bit, goes back up, come back down. So across the Western industrialized world is a problem in the 1970s. Also, here you have a picture of what deindustrialization looks like. It's a burnt out old factory. Not exactly a pretty thing. And again, factories aren't pretty anyway, but you get the idea. And there's Jimmy Carter. Picture, I guess that's from a campaign stop in 76. There's Walter Mondale, his VP. That's his wife right there. So that is Jimmy. The same time all this is going on, you still have conflicts over the rights revolution. The attempt to forcibly integrate people, I think I mentioned this before, and to try to rectify disparities in things like hiring for African Americans and minorities, leads to a backlash. Mentioned this before. You have a scheme where you bus students, and this was done in the South without much opposition. In the North, it was really fought because you're sometimes on the one hand you're busing black kids into white schools. In other cases, you're taking white schools and um, busing them into um, other neighborhoods, other African American schools, and there was a huge row over this, especially in the North, in places like Boston. There was actually what amounted to a riot over this. And yes, racism is part of it, definitely, but it's also partly because you had ethnic whites who had, they'd been working class, they'd worked their way up into a middle class neighborhood, they moved to the suburbs, and all of a sudden they get moved back into, worse schooling. So they didn't appreciate this at all. And so it was a huge backlash over this. It's one of the things Nixon took advantage of in his campaign in 1972. And of course, there was a backlash against affirmative action. The Voting Rights Act had allowed for this, what it called affirmative action on behalf of minorities. And this meant using things like quotas in things like government hiring and allowing, for example, law schools, medical schools to set aside a certain number of entrance applications for minorities, despite there being disparities in, for example, in aptitude. This came to a head in 1978 with the Bok case, Bok versus the University of California, in which Alan Bok, who was a white man, was a 33-year-old man, was a veteran, sued the University of California at Davis Medical School for rejecting him in favor of less qualified minority candidates. I think his test scores were something like in the 97th percentile, which is to say he could have gotten into pretty much any medical school in the country. Whereas some of the black applicants who got in over him were like, they were down like the 20th percentile or something like that. And excuse me. Excuse me. I'm not dying yet. Well, we're all dying, but you get the idea. I'm not dead yet. The Supreme Court rejected a quota system. They upheld Bok's lawsuit, but they, on the one hand, they basically said you couldn't set aside quotas. What you could do, though, however, is allow what I'm looking for. You could allow other factors besides test scores to determine who gets in. In other words, ethnic and social diversity was a part of what you could take into account, not just test scores. So in other words, they allowed it without allowing it effectively. And it still remains obviously a contentious issue. It's not as much as anymore because things have moved on from that. But again, it's one of the one of the sort of problems you got with the rights revolution in terms of trying to rectify disparities, economic and otherwise, between African Americans and their minorities and the majority of white Americans. You also have women's rights being a contentious issue. In 1972, the Roe versus Wade, in a decision, overturns a Texas law that prohibited abortion under any circumstances. And in fact, did more than that. There were, at that point, laws on the books in most of the states against abortion. I want to say, actually, no, there had been a few years before that, there had been some states, New York, Hawaii, California, places you'd expect, that had made abortion legally easier to adopt, but there were still restrictions on it. Roe versus Wade got rid of all the restrictions and based this on a new standard totally, the right to privacy, excuse me, which had been sort of first brewed in a case in 1965 on contraception, Griswold versus Connecticut. There have been laws, still laws in the books against selling contraceptives. It got rid of it. It's introduced that concept and enshrined it into law in Roe versus Wade, which you can say it led to the birth of the pro-life movement, obviously. At the same time, buoyed by all this, buoyed by the courts. Again, it's the court that tends to initiate a lot of this. You have a fight for the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment would have done, I haven't here in front of me. It would have been things trying to think like equal pay and stuff like this. In any case, Congress adopted the amendment in 1972, and within 2 years, 34 of 38 states ratified. It needed 38. Guys, be quiet. Sorry, my dogs are barking. You had, 34 of the states had passed it. It looked like it was going to pass. And there was a time limit, by the way. You had to get it ratified in a certain number of states, a certain number of years. And it was stopped. And the person who's most responsible for stopping it was Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly, who was a lawyer, conservative activist, and her organization stopped ERA. Basically, went around the country and managed to stop the thing. Not her by herself or her organization. It was the prime mover in all this. And within a few years, it basically died. There've been a couple attempts to resurrect it. It's never gone anywhere for a variety of reasons. And then finally, you have also in the 1970s, with, again, the spike in crime that starts in the end of the 1960s, continues in the 1970s. This kind of thing, by the way, is also reflected in films in the 1970s, kind of a crime people were used to living with. You had increasing criticisms of the court, about the Warren Court. Earl Warren was the Chief Justice until 1954 to 69. But even as you get into the 1970s, you're having increasing criticisms of the courts as being soft on crime, on not doing enough to punish offenders. And this is, again, part of the sort of general critique is that this conservative activists had is that if you their softness on crime is leading to social breakdown and rising crime rates, and that'll be part of push this into there. Getting into it is the rise of this new conservative movement in the 1970s. Here you can see a March for Affirmative Action. They're arguing against the Bach decision in 1978. Activists who, again, opposed the opposition, obviously. And this is a list of the states that ratified, did not ratify the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. It also should be in your textbook, I think. And this is a picture of Phyllis Schlafly from the 1970s, microphones doing an interview. But yeah, she's the woman who did all this. Excuse me. So you have a conservative reaction setting into all this social experimentation, all this, march through the courts to establish rights, going along with changes in family life, which are basically due to a couple of things. One is economic decline. The stagnation of wages were one of the biggest developments of the era, especially for people who were blue collar without college degrees. Between 1973 and the early 1990s, every major income group in the country, except the top 10%, saw their real earnings, accounting for inflation, either remain the same or decline. So life is literally getting economically worse for most people for a couple of decades. Women more and more now are going into the workforce, and Americans are going to be more and more dependent on a two-income household. So these things are changing the way that family life is governed, as is, of course, the so-called sexual revolution. By the 1960s, sex before marriage has become more socially acceptable. The biggest thing that happens, of course, and I didn't even talk about this in the last lecture and glossed over it, but the most important thing is the introduction of the birth control pill in 1960. the counterculture, all these things, and the influence of feminism really begin to sort of undermine traditional, models of the family. And a lot of Americans worried that marriage itself was threatened. You had, changing sexual values, rising divorce rates, so on and so forth. Um, and Many people believe that um, marriage came out with these new stresses. There was a whole therapeutic industry that arises in response to this, and churches and secular groups will establish marriage seminars and counseling services and so on and so forth. Um, but it should be noted, by the way, when I say people were worried about marriage and family life, it was on both sides of the divide. It was liberal and conservative. They both had different, very different views on what it should be and what should be done to prop it up. But there was a concern on both sides, more on the conservative side, obviously. But it's part of this reaction. The other part of this reaction is a surge in religious adherence, which sometimes people call the Fourth Great Awakening. In the 1970s, the evangelical churches, evangelical Protestant churches, began to flourish like they had not in a long time. And in fact, the sort of born again evangelical types became politically active in this period in causes like Stop ERA and stuff like this. Um, um, a lot of this Fourth Great Awakening again is already they're going into. I mean, the evangelical churches are growing throughout the 50s and 60s. Two things are notable here. One is that by the 60s, the mainline Protestant churches, the older, more traditional Protestant churches, and the Catholic Church are beginning to decline, while the evangelicals are growing. Second thing is this Second Great Awakening is partly a response to the secular liberalism of the late 60s and early 70s. A lot of these evangelicals regard feminism, the counterculture, these sorts of things, pornography, divorce, abortion, homosexuality, as collective signs of moral decay. And so evangelical ministries begin to spring up across the country, to become more and more, let's say, politicized. They get involved in these types of issues. And you have this, growth of evangelical churches, the growth of televangelists and stuff like this. And one of the big concerns was the family. And so you're going to have this religious element being pushed into all this in the 1960s. And there have been concern, by the way, again, this predates the 1970s, but it's going to become come entrenched with a new coalition on the right. Because what you're going to have is what's sometimes called the fusionism of the new right. It begins, well, the idea goes back to an editor, Frank Meyer, who was the editor of the National Review back in the 60s, who proposed a sort of alliance between different wings of the Republican Party. And it actually begins before the 1960s. In 1964, two people came to prominence in 1964. One was Barry Goldwater, who was the Republican nominee for president that year, who got wiped out by Lyndon Johnson. But Barry Goldwater was sort of a libertarian, in favor of small government, low taxation, law and order. But at the Republican convention that year, someone else stole the spotlight, and that was the actor Ronald Reagan. He gave a powerful speech supporting the nomination of Goldwater. And eventually, Reagan will get elected governor of California. He will also run for president in 1976 and come very close to knocking off Gerald Ford. And his growing popularity will make him a candidate in 1980, obviously. In 1964, this message of low taxes, and law and order, small government didn't appeal to many people. By the mid 1970s, with all the sort of, again, the sort of liberal experiments in government seeming to fail, this becomes a lot more popular. And what happens here is you have a uniting of three very distinct branches of the party. One is anti-communism. Everyone basically here is in this group are anti-communists. You did have, on the one hand, you'd had, excuse me, you've had before. This had not always been in the case. This was not an easy feat. Remember, evangelicals like William Jennings Bryan had been opposed to financial interests. So going along with the free marketers was partly a matter of, okay, you support free markets, we'll support your whatever your pro-family agenda. But all three of these, the free market types, the anti-communist, they're all basically ardent anti-communists. Being against the commies was the big thing. And since the 1950s, again, on the right, there had been a turn toward more libertarian economics with the influence of people like William Buckley, Milton Friedman, who was very important for these sorts of things, began to spawn, more, again, you say libertarian economic proposals to strip, dial back government programs, stuff like this. But the most important and the most striking part of this coalition was the religious right. And it's not just because of the rise of evangelical, partly because conservative Protestants, but also Roman Catholics joined together in this alliance. And I have to, I have to stress this, just how unprecedented that is. We talked about this throughout this course. Anti-Catholicism was a real powerful force in this country. And it took things like Roe versus Wade to overcome that suspicion. That brought them together in the 1970s. Then you have, again, people like later on the 70s. That's a real, actual, amazing feat. But people like Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, preachers who have a sort of, faith-based political agenda in the late 1970s. Falwell establishes the Moral Majority, which is his political advocacy group. And so you have big organizations who can organize the right and get out the vote and all that sort of stuff. I mentioned Phyllis Schlafly. She had her own had a women's group called the Eagle Forum, which advocated for conservative policies and so on and so forth. And other types of groups are created in the 1970s. And so by the late 1970s, the right has a message that's beginning to appeal to more and more people who see the country declining, who see government doing a lot with their money, but not getting a lot out of it. And so that will come to the fore in that age. And you can see here again the increase in two-worker families throughout the 1970s, the decline of the husband, one breadwinner family. This is a photo. It says family values. I'm assuming that's the Moral Majority. That's Jerry Falwell there. That's obviously Phyllis Schlafly there. Excuse me. All this coincides with the sort of nadir of liberalism in Jimmy Carter's presidency. Again, he is a decent man who meant well, but he didn't do very well. He eschewed Richard Nixon's realism in foreign policy for a very idealistic foreign policy. Yeah, he favored human rights and peacemaking. He tried to he tried to make concessions with the Soviets, but with the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 by the Soviets, he withdrew from talks and then boycotted the Summer Olympics that year in Moscow. He did in 1970s reach an agreement, hosted an agreement between peace settlement between Israel and Egypt. But his undoing in some ways was the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which the Shah of Iran, who was backed by the United States, was overthrown by an Islamic revolution. Iranian students at the university seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, took a bunch of Americans hostage. They would not be released until after he had been defeated in his presidential bid. But it was also partly because Carter was kind of a dour person. He got on television and talked about the country going through melees, and he didn't have a very Americans don't like bad news. They don't like people who aren't upbeat, and he wasn't upbeat. And by the time you get to his bid for re-election, his approval rating was like 21%. He was faced by Ronald Reagan, who defeats him. Reagan basically declared in his debates that he would quote, get the government off our backs. And he appealed to a lot of Americans who felt financially insecure, and in particular appealed to a lot of working class, working class former Democrats, a lot of them Catholics in the Midwest and places like that. Sometimes called Reagan Democrats. That's basically who they were, because he kind of appealed to them in cultural terms. In any event, Reagan won 51% of the popular vote and became president in 1980. Took office in 1981, and the Reagan coalition, for the most part, remained. The core of it remained on affluent white Protestant voters who wanted small government, were opposed to government activism, wanted law and order, were against communism, those sorts of things. But it was already beginning to attract people in suburbia who had migrated to the Sun Belt states. And along with that coalition of Reagan Democrats, along with the religious right, excuse me. And in his first year in office, Reagan had tried to roll back the federal deficit, roll back federal taxes, all this other stuff. They adopted a really massive increase in defense spending. They tried to, get tough with the Soviet Union. And they tried, basically the idea of Reaganomics was to increase, as they called it, to increase production, thus the supply of goods. This is the supply side theory of economics. Again, it presumed that future tax revenues would make up for present tax cuts. And he got a massive tax cut passed in 1981. The top tax rate dropped from 70% to 50%. That is to say, in the top tax bracket, the government took 70% of your money back then. It's at 39%, I think, last I checked today. Reagan was hoping to balance the budget by cutting programs, but nobody, not even Reagan's people around him, were willing to touch things like Social Security. Way too popular. And so basically, they basically ballooned the deficit throughout his term of office. By the time he left office, the federal debt had tripled from to $2.8 trillion. So part of the legacy of him trying to basically spin the Soviet Union into oblivion. So he got a tax cut, he got an increase in defense spending, but he never really did try to scale back big government. It kept growing anyway. And this is sometimes, this is one of the things people tend to debate about Reagan, is how much did he really do? Made him wildly popular. The first couple of years he was in office, he wasn't, because of a recession, but whether it was a Reagan revolution or not, another story. By the time his tax cuts had a chance to sort of they'd had their effect and the economy recovered, he was wildly popular in 1984 and won a resounding victory in that time as well. But his revolution's kind of part of, I say it's a revolution. I don't think it's that revolutionary myself, is the point. Besides cutting taxes and increasing spending, not a whole lot, defense spending, not a whole lot else actually changed. By 1985, you have a country that's transitioning to a service economy. By 1985, more people in the United States work for McDonald's than worked in industry. So you're having that transition going on. Things like what you know today: financial services, medical services, computer services, services broadly speaking, were the way of the future. We have gone from a country that makes things to a country that produces services. And so this will have long-term consequences. One thing I should mention as going on in the conservative era, going from the 70s and 80s, let's mention this briefly, is the increasing use of computers. The first computers for military purposes were used for military purposes during World War II, and it was Cold War military research that had funded the construction of large mainframe computers. Between the 1950s and 1970s, with the development of the microprocessor in 1971, computers got smaller and smaller that started selling them to people in their own homes. And so in 1976, you have the founding of Apple by Steve Jobs. You have later on, of course, the founding of excuse me, in 1975, the founding of Microsoft. And it's amazing how much of these again, I can't stress how much of the actual funding and creation of computers took place with military funding. It started because of that. For example, the first, I don't know, was absolutely the first one, but the first institution to have not the internet, but an internet they had their computers all hooked up to was the Department of Defense in 1980. So we'll get to that. That migrates from the defense world to the private world. So a lot of this stuff, even in the era of Reagan, was dependent on, again, government spending, despite the sort of, despite the political success of the man. One thing about Reagan is that he got his vice president reelected. He got his vice president elected after him, George H.W. Bush. That's a rare event. But he was popular. This is from the campaign trail in 1984. Again, a smooth speaker, a good actor, obviously. Well, a good actor, but he's a B-movie actor. But Reagan once famously said he couldn't understand how anybody could be president who hadn't been an actor, which should gives you a lot of insight into the modern presidency, I think. Any case, the me decade ends with the end of the Cold War. And what happens under Reagan is that he puts an end to detente. He breaks with his immediate predecessors, whereas Nixon had regarded himself as a realist, Carter was an idealist. Reagan and his advisors were hawks. They wanted to defeat the Soviets. In 1983, he gave a famous speech in which he described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And he outlined his philosophy, which was basically to match Soviet military expansion and surpass it. The idea was basically to sort of, his thinking was very simple. We have more money. We can build a lot more weaponry. If we keep building enough, they'll have to keep up. It'll bankrupt them. That's basically it. He deployed U.S. missiles to Europe in 1983, which led to a lot of a backlash, because it put, nuclear weapons in Europe, and there was an anti-nuclear arms movement that sprang up to deal with all this stuff. Yeah, and so this was the part of the other. I say, well, that's one prong of this, is the buildup of the American military strength. The second prong of this, his strategy was to roll back Soviet influence in the developing world by funding anti-communist movements in Africa and Asia and Central America. This is partly what got him in trouble in Guatemala during the 1980s. This is the so-called Iran-Contra affair. I won't go into too much detail. It's in your textbook, but excuse me, Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, basically Reagan encouraged a coup against the left-wing communist Sandinista government there, and so you had U.S.-backed rebels who were like basically death squads going around murdering members of the opposition. And so again, he got into trouble when funding for this came to light in the 1960s. Again, the United States, if you don't know, I don't have time to go into this here, I don't want to belabor this, have been involved in a lot of dirty things in Latin America. He also, of course, besides that, was also um, Ronald Reagan also did occasionally bomb a few places. He bombed Libya in 1985. Um, um, he uh, sent troops to Grenada in 1983. He did not actually respond with force that much, though. Ronald Reagan didn't actually start any wars abroad, big conflicts, um, for the most part. Despite the fact that he talked tough, he didn't actually do a whole lot, which may have been part of the point. The other part of this was, in terms of U.S.-Soviet relations, was the coming to power of someone who, on the Soviet side, wanted to ratchet things down, and that would be Mikhail Gorbachev. Leonid Brezhnev, who'd been the premier of the Soviet Union in 1982, dies. A couple of older men replace him. When they die in office, 1985, Gorbachev takes control, and he begins almost immediately initiating a series of reforms in Moscow. And basically, he's trying to open the Soviet Union up, if that makes any sense. It had been kind of a lockdown state, and so he begins trying to experiment with things like what he calls glasnost, or openness of speech, a restructuring of the Soviet economy, a tentative trying to introduce market incentives into the a communist economy, and then trying to actually have real elections in at least in local areas in the Soviet Union. And this was paralleled by his efforts to try to make better relationships with Western powers. 1984, even before he becomes party leader, he meets with Margaret Thatcher, who was the leader of Great Britain, and so all this is to say is Gorbachev begins to take a more lenient stance toward the West. He begins to take lenient stance, especially towards Soviet satellite regimes in Eastern Europe. He begins to, for example, to end aid to Soviet satellite republics, right? Hey, we're not going to prop you up anymore. And he didn't really seem to have a good idea, didn't seem to understand this was going to lead to the end of these states, which is what eventually happens. Um, and in fact, what he wanted them to do is follow his lead in making these reforms he was trying to make in the Soviet Union. And his counterparts in those countries knew better and reclined to do this. At one point, things got so bad, the leader of East Germany, a man named Erich Honecker, actually banned the Russian newspaper Pravda in East Germany because it contained reports of reforms in the Soviet Union. In other words, it meant Gorbachev was going to stop promoting communism abroad, basically. And effectively, the only thing that was propping up these communist countries was Soviet support. Gorbachev didn't realize that. But it's because of his willingness to talk, things did eventually come to an end. 1985, he began talks with Reagan about reducing nuclear arms. In 1987, they actually signed a treaty to remove all medium and short-range nuclear missiles, and relations got better. Long story short, you began to have a thaw, and Reagan had no problem negotiating from as long as it was from a position of strength, which it was. The Soviets were quite aware they couldn't keep up with the military buildup in the United States. That's part of the reason why Gorbachev went and did what he did. And say that things thaw out by 1987. He also, one of the things that's going on, of course, during the 1980s, there's this bad war. The Soviets are involved in Afghanistan. They're bogged down. They finally pull out eventually in 1988. And so what happens to lead to the end of communism, on a breeze by all this, is that this effectively begins to signal to peoples in Eastern Europe that that Gorbachev is no longer going to prop up these regimes. And once the various dissident groups in these Eastern European countries, they're the ones who start this, not the United States, they begin to sort of push back against these governments. It starts in Poland, where Solidarity, which was a worker movement, basically forces the government, the communist government there, to hold real elections. And they're supposed to have, only elections in a few places and only a few candidates. And in June of 1989, they hold elections and Solidarity candidates win everything, even though they weren't on the ballot. They basically wipe out the communists. And effectively, again, part of what makes this happen is that Gorbachev does nothing. And so they basically have to give up power. There's a peaceful revolution in Poland in that summer. What happens in the fall is that people begin in East Germany, which is, again, behind the Berlin Wall. People start they start fleeing the country via Hungary initially. And then eventually, again, you have people start gathering early November of 1989, people gathering at the wall itself, begin trying to press through. Again, the major decision goes back to Gorbachev. Erich Honecker, the leader of the East Germany, begged Gorbachev to send troops to put all this down. He refused, and they just started letting people go, and they tore down the wall. And effectively, about a year or so, almost every communist regime in Eastern Europe was gone. And by 1990, Germany's reunited as one country. And then a couple other things happen in between then. Go through this briefly. Is the first Gulf War. Long story short, Saddam Hussein, who is the president, dictator of Iraq, invades Kuwait, claiming its oil fields for Iraq. The United States gets a coalition behind it in the United Nations, sends a force there, defeats them, drives them back into Iraq, doesn't pursue it to the end. Bush the first, George H.W. Bush, who was the president at the time, could have pushed further in, doesn't go there, but does leave a sort of no-fly zone in over Iraqi airspace to keep Saddam Hussein from doing bad things to his own people there. So there is this. There's also sanctions that are put on Iraq going forward as well. So it leads to the United States getting involved in the Middle East in a major way. And then finally, in 1991, the USSR comes to an end. There is a coup. Generals kidnap Gorbachev, take him away. Eventually, people in Moscow, Boris Yeltsin, along with some other people in the government, basically abandon the hardliners. He's restored. Eventually, the Soviet Union breaks apart. They allow these other countries to leave. One of whom, of course, in 1991 is the Ukraine, which becomes independent in that year. And so that's the end of communism and the end of the Cold War, which looks like the United States has come out of shining and new and victorious. Here you have a picture of Reagan and Gorbachev, fellow political revolutionaries. You can call them that. I'd say more Gorbachev than Reagan, but there we go. Then, of course, you have here what the breakup of the Soviet Union looked like, just to give you an idea. This was all their territory at one point, but over here, all these became independent. You can see the dates there: 1990s, 1991. All these states, obviously, they're still linked with Russia, but these are, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. They became independent in the 1990s. All that stuff had once been part. You see how big the Soviet Union was, actually. And down here, two places, obviously, well, three. Belarus, which is today allied with Moscow. Down here is Georgia. Georgia is a country that's right next to the Soviet Union, as you can see. In 2008, Russia actually invaded Georgia. I'll come to that in a second. Down here, Armenia and everything else. So you have that, that breakup there. And here's members of the European Union, European Economic Union, which original members up to 1995. You'll see, just how original members and then original members after up to the 1995. But you see, again, it's a Western European economic bloc. It's Western Europe as a unified trading bloc against the East there. Excuse me. Apologize if I am not on my game with this cold. So we come to the end of with a a conservative government. It looks like you've had 12 years of Republican president. You've had a victory in the Cold War. It seems to vindicate Reagan's Reagan's policies. And for the next 25 years or so, this is the sort of unipolar moment, just to give this coda, this age of globalization. It looked like the world was our oyster. And for the most part, the United States acted like, because they couldn't act like they did. They acted in a different way than they had during the Cold War. For example, Kuwait invades, excuse me, Iraq invades Kuwait in 1990, and we go and we take an army there. It's a UN army, it's our army basically, and try to oppose it. In 1956, the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. There was a big uprising in Budapest, and they basically put it down brutally. Eisenhower thought about doing it, but he's like, "Nah, I'm not going to get involved with a military, power like that." But now that the Soviet Union by 1990 was in no condition to oppose us anymore. They could go in there and do what they wanted. They no longer had a peer competitor that could restrain its impulses, and so restraint went to the four winds. And so America, of course, has been involved in the Middle East ever since. Air bases, military bases to this day. I'll show you a map in a second. In Saudi Arabia, other places, Kuwait, the Middle East. Fought another Iraq war there. Afghanistan's more in the middle, more in Asia than it is in Middle East, but still, you can see our policy becomes aggressive, interventionist. Again, we act like the only superpower on Earth, which we were at that point. At the same time, another thing that happens, of course, obviously, I should put it on here, but of course, you have the war on terror, which is I should have put on it should have been on the slides in my notes. Oh well. So you have that that as well, which is partly, of course, a response to our interventions in the Middle East, which was it starts, of course, in 1993 with the first World Trade Center attack in 1993, which didn't go off and only destroyed part of the parking garage there. Then later on, U.S. coal was attacked in 2000. Then, of course, 2001, the towers were brought down. So all those things are a result of our victory in the Cold War. The other thing that's a result of our victory in the Cold War is that the United States had a decision to make after the Cold War was over. Do we get rid of NATO? Do we need it now? It was there to take, to sort of defend against Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is not there anymore, and they decided it pretty quickly. They did want to keep it and expand it, and partly this is because they thought, hey, we won the Cold War. Liberal democracy is the way to go. If liberal democracy spreads, there'll be more peace and less war. And so, in the late 1990s, they began to expand membership in NATO. Countries, as you'll see, I'll show you a map in a second, the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, other places right on Russia's border, they expanded into. Even though there were many observers who believed that in the 1990s, they said this, that extending NATO into Eastern Europe would damage U.S.-Russian relations. It would lead to conflict in the long run. The man who invented the containment policy, George Kennan, came out of retirement. He'd long since retired in the 1990s. He gave an interview just to say how much he hated this idea. He basically said there's no reason for this. The Russians have, they have legitimate security concerns. There's no reason to expand NATO. They're not really expansionist. This was said openly back in the 1990s. And so you have, in the 1990s, President Bill Clinton getting involved in places that are, because of NATO, excuse me, that are kind of in the Russian orbit, if you will. If you recall, at the end of the Cold War, the new states, the former Yugoslavia, Slovenia, Croatia emerged from this. In Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1992, you had a mostly Muslim province declare independence, but there was a big Serbian population there. This led to a campaign of ruthless ethnic cleansing. This was violence. And so in 1995, President Clinton organized a bombing campaign led by NATO, backed by 20,000 American troops, that ended the Serbs' campaign there. 4 years later in Kosovo in 1999, you also had a bombing campaign initiated by the United States, which was, again, meant to keep Kosovo as, again, as this province, another Serbian-dominant province of the former Yugoslavia, try to preserve its autonomy. This, of course, they bombed Serbian cities, right? And so this enraged the Russians. Serbia is a Russian ally. This is the beginning of the end, by the way. There had been some attempts during the 1990s to try to have, during the early days of newly independent Russia after it lost the Soviet Union, this permanently poisoned things, because at this point we had to see the United States as a sort of opponent again. Which is the beginnings of what's led to all this, because NATO expansion, again, 2004 was expanded again. Then in 2008, they announced they were going to expand NATO by bringing Ukraine and Georgia, the country of Georgia, who are both running Russia's borders, into NATO. And the Russians told the United States in no uncertain terms they would never allow it, that it was an existential threat to them. They would go to war, which they did. In 2008, they invaded Georgia because there were ethnic Russians in the state of Georgia. They claimed were being persecuted or whatever by the Georgian president. And they defeated the Georgian army. And again, that was partly aimed at that. So looking for background for current events, that's part of what's going on here. The other thing, of course, that has happened in the last 25 years is that China has emerged as really the replacement for the Soviet Union, really, a real peer competitor, mostly, of course, because of its economic power. Between 2000 and 2008, China quadrupled its gross domestic product, and it's been growing like a bear ever since. Again, it started from a lot lower place on the totem pole, so that's why they had more room to grow. Of course, the United States was very intent on trying to break into the Chinese market because there's a couple billion people there. And China remains a sort of, go back for a second, I'm not done yet. China remains a rival, part because they've embraced, to a certain degree, capitalism. Its factories produce most of what we buy, apparently, these days, essentially. And so there is this sort of there is this relationship between the United States and China, but they're clearly now rivals, I think. And China has become the term is peer competitor in political terms. They can hope to rival us militarily, but also economically speaking, even though, again, maybe not quite yet where we're at. But that's the assumption. Again, there's possibilities that may not happen for other reasons, but China has emerged along with Russia as, again, peers who have basically this unipolar. My point is, this unipolar moment has come to an end because of all the things that have happened in the last 25 years or so. Here's just a map of all the major interventions going before 1991, but I mean, this is going up to 2014 or so, and it's all over the place. Again, going back to Reagan's airstrikes against Gaddafi, the U.S. supporting, forgot about the United States supporting Libyan rebels against Gaddafi. I mean, this could go all Syria. I mean, haven't mentioned the stuff in Syria. And I mentioned the stuff in Syria. They're almost. It's not even enough stuff. There's not enough space on the map to put all the stuff we've done on this map, to give you an idea how we've been involved in the Middle East. And this is a map of NATO. and how its membership has expanded. You can see the dark blue countries are the ones that were there 1949 up to the end of the Cold War. You can see that ring going up there. You see what's been added in the 1990s. We have Poland, Hungary, like this. And then later on in the 2000s, you have Romania and the Baltic states and Bulgaria and places like that. And you, of course, you see here, again, there's Georgia down here. And then here, of course, is the Ukraine. And this is the areas, just to give you clarify right there. This is the Donbass. This is controlled by Russian-backed separatists. This is the Crimea, which the Russians took in 2014. You can see how big the Ukraine is. This is one of the reasons why the Russians, it's a big country to try to take over. So it looks like they're going to try to get a land bridge going down here to connect Crimea to the Donbass and stay there. But that is their rationale. They're aligned with Belarus, so they're not on their doorstep. But that is the march of NATO by 2022. And here's just a map showing the military presence, U.S. military presence around the world. How many bases in how many countries, and how many troops in how many countries. And the thing that probably might surprise you more than anything else is that, well, take a look at this. The two places where we have the most troops, the most bases, are the two places we were built after World War II. Germany, Japan, and to a lesser extent, Italy. Can you imagine? But we have a lot of troops, have a lot of bases everywhere else, as you can see. In Australia, of all places. Amazing. We have them in Canada. We have them in the UK, in Spain, in the Middle East, in Turkey. So there you go. The policeman of the world. Another aspect of the world in the age of globalization is borders. Is it a borderless world? And one of the things your textbook mentions, and I'll briefly go over it here, is the internet era begins in the early 1990s. In the early 90s, you begin to have, the internet had spread to universities by the 1980s, but it becomes, in the early 90s, the World Wide Web becomes a popular thing. And so you begin to have that, that's when it begins, 1990s, post-war, post-Cold War. And I should mention, by the way, just to give you an idea, when it begins, in 1998, Congress passed an Internet Tax Exemption Act, which banned taxation of access to the internet, as well as any special taxes on internet companies. I mentioned that this, by the way, has been extended. It's still in force. It's this exemption from taxation that allowed Amazon to become the dominant online seller. Well, it started out as a bookseller. That's how they destroyed all the other bookstore chains in the country because they couldn't compete with them because they didn't have any overhead. They just needed warehouses to ship stuff. So you can thank Congress for inadvertently creating Amazon. And of course, you also have, just the internet era means that, as Lawrence Summers, who was the Secretary of Treasury in Bill Clinton's administration, said that data is the ultimate public good, unquote. The era where digital data becomes, everything, basically. You also have the rise in the last 25 years of an international, global ruling class. You have, with the end of the Cold War, all the sort of barriers to international trade and capitalist development sort of go away, and so you begin to have big multinational corporations being constructed, other international organizations, NGOs and stuff like this, set the rules for worldwide capitalism. In fact, during the final decades of the Cold War, the leading capitalist nations had met together to manage global policy, the G7 nations. Russia joins this group in 1997, the G8. And so you have, again, the rise of essentially a global sort of class, a global ruling class. And in fact, in the United States, this is what the political scientist, late political scientist Samuel Huntington called Davos man, and it's a phrase that refers to The World Economic Forum, which was founded in the 70s, when world leaders go there, meets in Davos in Switzerland. Somebody just wrote a book with that title, by the way. It doesn't mean the same. The guy who wrote the book is apparently a left winger he's worried about economic inequality. Sam Huntington was a real right wing guy who, when he coined that phrase Davos man, he didn't mean, I don't think he was concerned about economic inequality. What he was concerned about was people who, having a global elite that didn't identify with its countries anymore, having corporations, legally American corporations whose headquarters are abroad now, whose board of directors are international. In other words, elites who no longer identify with their own countries and see the world as one big supply chain and not as actual nations. This is why I have the question mark on borderless world. And you can see this in policies in the United States. Federal government was worried about the potential, seems quaint now, the potential of the European Union, economically speaking, back in the early 1990s. So Congress passed a trade treaty, the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994, which envisioned the creation of a free trade zone covering all of North America. And this is, again, about opening up American workers to competition from other countries. NAFTA began, the opposition to it came from labor unions. They got crushed, naturally. You also had, more momentously, in the year 2000, you had the United States grant most favored trading status to China. There was a lot of debate about this at the time. Partly was about China's human rights record, which isn't great, but also it was about, again, flooding our country with cheap Chinese goods, which in the long run, of course, is part of what has caused that's really what those two things, but especially that granting most favored nation status to China, put the final nail in the coffin to our industrial sector. It really hollowed out what was left of heavy industry in this country. You also have, in this post-Cold War world, again, big multinational corporations don't care about citizenship that much, and they don't care. They care about cheap labor, and so immigration becomes a massive sort of issue. You're going to have non-governmental organizations claiming it to be a human right, that people should be allowed to go where they want. This is, of course, going to cause, as you've seen the last 10 years or so, problems with, of course, workers, where these are basically cheap labor replacing them. So that's going to become a massive issue, obviously. And in fact, what's going to happen, several people have suggested this. I think this is probably the right way to see this, but globalization has created, it's created winners and losers, but it's also created centers and peripheries. Centers where the economy is good, where it's tied into the global economy, and where it's not, basically. I mentioned a couple of people that are kind of interesting here. There's a British author named David Goodhart, wrote a book in 2016. I don't remember the name of it, but I think it was called Somewheres versus Anywheres. That was his shtick. The basic idea is that the global economy tends to favor people who he calls them anywheres, people who are they're both economically but also socially more mobile. They're just as comfortable in London as they are in Singapore, as they are in New York, as they are in Paris. A global world led to like global cities where they all kind of like meld together. And again, it goes back to what Sam Huntington was pointing to. You have a global class that seems a lot more comfortable with each other than they are with their own peoples. Whereas somewheres, and David Goodhart's talking about this, people who are not part of that as much and who still value their ties to their localities, to where they grew up, to their nation, stuff like this, increasingly being cut out of the global economy. Similar thing was suggested by a French writer, I'll butcher his name, Christopher Guilluy, Guilluy, wrote a book in 2018 called The Twilight of the Elites. And he basically said the same thing was happening in France, that certain centers in France were being, they were growing wealthy at the expense of others. And so you have this division based on globalization happening within countries. And you can see, by the way, this is the United States. It's the increase in numbers of people of foreign birth as you go further into time. The direct result, by the way, of political policies. This isn't normal. It's not natural. You change the laws, change the enforcement mechanisms, it would change. So it's a matter of politics. But of course, basically, no matter what people did, the government basically made it happen. So even though there was big pushback against it. And this is just a Nike factory in China, one of its many lovely sweatshops where it pays people nothing and works them half to death. I'm only being half facetious, but again, offshoring is a thing, obviously. Of course, a lot of that globalism has led to discontent. It's also led to, well, and this is one of the things I'm talking about in the course, decline of the, and I'm singling out white working class for a reason, decline because, I'll show you the map in a second. People notice this because this is, made famous in the election of Donald Trump. The white working class seemed to be hardest hit, both not just in an economic sense with the hollowing out of the industrial base of the country, but also in the 2000s, 2010 onward, you began to see just an increase in deaths among middle-aged white working class men. I'll show you the map, it's pretty clear. And of course, there was a famous study that came out the year of the election by Cass and Deaton are their names. I can't remember the name of it, but they're the ones who noticed this trend of white middle-aged men either dying or committing suicide. That's another thing. There's been a spike in suicides among white middle-aged men. And so this is linked to the loss of, it's not just loss of jobs, loss of status. White working class men don't, again, you're not just out of a job, you're in an economy now that doesn't value your work. And so you have, if you don't have a family life, you have nothing else to live for. And so people are literally killing themselves. Of course, you also have, and I've forgotten their names, drug companies who are literally pushing drugs on these people as well. I think it's the Sackler family. These vicious people who just basically said, yeah, we didn't really care if they died off. And so all these other sort of depressing things began to happen. You also, of course, had a massive recession in 2008 caused by a collapse of the housing market that was propped up by one of things anyway. It was overrated in 2008. All this fed into the election of Donald Trump. Of course, in 2008, all this came to a head, and a lot of our politics, again, if you wanted to see it, you don't have to go globalist versus nationalist, but again, the tensions that globalization's brought about within the country, they look a lot like some of the things I've already pointed out. The winners of globalization versus its losers, those people who feel attached to their country, and those people who don't seem to care as much about it. I'm not saying they don't care, but like there's definitely a difference of opinion, right? And this is when a lot of people, of course, were upset and mad about where the country was going. I mentioned the election of Donald Trump. I should have also mentioned at the very least, he had at least one good go around with Bernie Sanders, kind of from the left. There's populist energy on both sides of the aisle, so unhappiness with the way the country was going. And all this is in the context, of course, of nationalism returning in Europe. With Brexit in 2016, when the British left the European Union, with the rise of nationalist regimes in Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, and Russia. Russia is, of course, a nationalist power, along with China. So you have the return of these things that American policymakers had thought had been banished by their triumph in the Cold War. And this is the map: drug, alcohol, and suicide mortality, non-white Hispanics, ages 45-54 from 2000 to 2007 to 2011 to 2014. Pretty clearly tied, again, not the only thing, tied to economic changes in the country. Kind of hard to ignore it. This is taken in 2015, so take it as this is 7 years old at this point, but this was taken in 2016, I should say. So around the time of the election of Donald Trump. And you can kind of see again, what is globalization a good thing? Interesting to see how many, uh, what countries say it is, it isn't. What, effective immigrants and stuff like this. So again, there's pushback against globalization and the quote unquote liberal international order, which for the most part is the American international order, really. And then finally, I won't go into this too much detail, but you living through all this stuff, but a couple of things. One is the rights revolution has continued apace. The courts keep creating new rights, activists keep demanding, courts keep giving in. So we're on this moment, transgenderism as the big, I believe Joe Biden said it was the transgender rights was the civil rights issue of our time. So it's keep going apace. Renewed racial tensions since the 2010s, obviously. The rise of Black Lives Matter as an activist organization has had a lot to do with this. And now bankrolled by a lot of very big corporations. We've had campus culture gone crazy. Not at JCCC, thankfully enough, but in many places, of course, you have that activism beginning there and going from there into the workplace. I'm not going to belabor all this stuff. Sort of going along with all this economic stuff, but then finally, I mentioned this because this is again something you are part of this, which is the rise of nones and the decline of religion. I mentioned this because it's significant because for almost all the period we're talking about in this course, up until the last 10 years or so, the United States had been a conspicuously religious nation among the Western industrialized nations. And in fact, it still is. Again, compared to its other competitors, I mean, the only ones that are anywhere near it, they're not anywhere near it in terms of economic power, would be places in Eastern Europe like Poland, or ironically enough, Ukraine. But they're not major players or anything like that. It's mostly the United States. But there's been a decline. You'll see this in a second. In the term "non," by the way, if you don't know what that means someone who doesn't recognize any sort of religious identity. Doesn't mean necessarily atheism. Doesn't mean necessarily can mean agnosticism, I guess. But and in a sense, the United States has always had a sort of DIY, a section of the population that's kind of DIY in religious sense, like people who do their own thing. So I don't know how you could possibly overrate it, but the numbers are actually pretty important because for the first time, as I'll show you here, this is early, it was like several years ago, 2017 or so. For the first time, people have been taking surveys since the 1930s. Fewer than half of Americans actually members of a religious body of some sort. So it's a pretty important important milestone, I think, to note. This is a picture from actually from Oakland, California in 2014. This is a riot that happened after the man Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri, and so the Black Lives Matter sign there amidst the chaos. Then finally, the chart I wanted to show you about church membership. You can see it kind of going down pretty precipitously. Again, as late as 2000s, about 70% of the population. Begins to dip a little bit in mid 2000s, still 61%, and then from about 2010, it's taken a complete dive, 14%. So big changes in the offing. So we lived through an era of division, of globalized societies, where we have even the further divisions and racial divisions and all these other sorts of things. And at least hopefully by now, you've listened to all this, you read all this stuff, you will have at least some background on how we've gotten here to the time in which we're living and in which we're experiencing all these things. So thank you guys for listening. I appreciate it. I hope you guys got something out of it. I wish you guys the best, all the best. Take care of yourselves. This is Derek Taylor signing off.